Tonight, before we start our program, that John Paul Kernot will be with us again with his guitar just before 7 o'clock. So those of you who are punctual or a little early will have a dividend. This afternoon, we're disregarding one of the presidential campaign principles of making sure that people come from opposite corners of the country, because we have two resident Californians on the rest of the program. But there is some disparity, I believe, in area of nativity. John sometimes talks about that. But in any event, we have two very distinguished California citizens here. The gentleman who's going to act as moderator is known to all of you, I'm sure. His brilliant writing, his thorough research, his scholarly approach to so many of these problems they have all been of tremendous help to those of us who are trying to keep well informed. And without his articles from time to time, fairly regularly in American Opinion and elsewhere, most of us would be far less well informed than we are now. And I am sorry we don't have time to let him deliver a full-fledged speech on his own, but I know you will be delighted to hear, even briefly, from Gary Allen.
Thank you, Colonel Bunker. I'm a dangerous man when I get a microphone in front of me. And I understand we're running a little ahead of time, which I'm sure is the first time in the history of the rally. So I'd like to take 45 minutes or an hour to speak to you on the Gary Allen Communications Automated Learning Program. I hope every one of you have been by my booth in here. And we'll cut the commercial short. I've had a number of great thrills at this rally. One of them was last night when I got to go out to dinner with not only my editor and Medford Evans and Janet Taylor Caldwell. We went to this famous restaurant here, I think it's called Pier 4, where it's famous for its seafood. Last night, however, they served roast Gary Allen. As Taylor Caldwell told me, I was just a child over and over again. How do you reply to an accusation like that? I thought of ordering a baby bottle. And then, of course, she told me about her childhood, which I'm sure most of you have read about in American Opinion. It is now out and growing up tough, from Devin Adair, which I hope you'll all buy a copy before you leave here. And I couldn't compare that. And finally this morning I thought of my only answer to Taylor Caldwell after she told me about how tough she'd had it. I should have looked her right in the eye and said, "Have you ever been chewed out by Robert Welch?" Then I could have stripped my coat and shirt and showed her the lacerations. And she surely would have said, "My son, you are no child." But the biggest thrill for me has to be when I walked upstairs Friday evening and John McKinney met me and showed me that I was going to have the honor to introduce John Schmitz to this great crowd. I live in Orange County, California. Orange County is famous for Disneyland, Knott's Berry Farm, hardcore Americans, and John Schmitz. I predict, and I'm no seeress like Taylor Caldwell is, but I predict that before another decade is through, that Orange County will be more famous for John Schmitz than for Disneyland, Knott's Berry Farm, and the hardcore Americans. I was so thrilled because I thought, last night as I was trying to think of what do I tell these people? Really the best thing I could do is come up here and get off because you don't want to listen to me, you want to listen to him. And I thought, well, how can I convey to them how thrilling it is for me to get to introduce this man? And I thought, well, maybe I could tell them that in my secular trinity of heroes, there's Robert Welch, Scott Stanley, and John Schmitz. And I thought, gee, I can't do that because I can't leave out Tom Anderson or Stuart Crane. And then I thought, well, really, there's no need for me to try to tell you what a great man this is. I'm really the superfluous man up here to sing the praises of John Schmitz because practically all of you know. I thought maybe I could tell you just a little bit about John's background because there may be some of you that aren't aware of that. John is a graduate of Marquette College. He's a former Marine Corps aviator. When he got out of the Marines, he did graduate work at Long Beach State College, right near my home. I first met John in 1964 when he was a college instructor at Santa Ana College in political science and philosophy. And a friend of mine who was president of the Anaheim Young Republicans invited me to come here a candidate for the California State Senate. And he said, told me that he was a college professor and a member of the John Birch Society. I thought, well, boy, I've got to hear this. I was not a member of the society at the time, and I went to hear him. And it's funny, usually you don't remember specifically what people say in speeches, you just have an impression. I was so impressed with John that there was one part of his speech that I asked him about 6 years later when I had the pleasure of having dinner with he and his wife one night. But I felt, if this man can join the John Birch Society, why aren't I in it? I don't think that's grammatically correct, but I did join. John is just the opposite of the typical politician. Even a lot of good men, when they start smelling that political office, they get a little hesitant on the Birch Society. Before John ran for the Senate, the last thing he did was join the John Birch Society. John has another asset, a fantastic one. He has a wife named Mary. Mary, would you stand up? She's not here. Well, I hope you'll have a chance to meet her. She is a beautiful woman. They have, I think, 7 kids now, John? The first 7. If you think John is hardcore, you should meet Mary. Mary belonged to the Birch Society before John did. And she's a truly remarkable person because can become, or is, hardcore, yet totally feminine. John was elected to the state senate in 1964, and for 6 years, whenever you'd pick up the Los Angeles papers, it would say, John Schmitz, an avowed member of the John Birch Society. I'm sure he got to thinking it was all part of his name. It was never separated. It's sort of like right-wing extremists. They've run it all together, or damn Yankee in the South. You never hear anything about Senator Glutz, an avowed member of the ADA, or an avowed member of the ACLU, but it was always John Schmitz, an avowed member of the John Birch Society. But John did a fantastic job in the California Senate. He is one of the few people I know who can be totally incisive, devastating, and yet not alienate people. And pretty soon there was a coterie of senators huddled around John Schmitz, finding out how they should vote up there. And I'm sure the same thing is being repeated in our Congress. In June of 1970, following the untimely death of Congressman James Udd, another fantastically great American, John ran for the United States Congress, where he incidentally represents the largest district. He was overwhelmingly elected out of a field of 5 or 6 or 7. If you don't get John Schmitz's newsletter, you're really missing something. I see, obviously, some of you do. John has told me that you can write to his office in Washington and request it. You can't request it for someone else. You have to request it for yourself because of congressional courtesy to others. You're not supposed to send something to somebody that's not solicited directly by them. But I'll tell you, it's magnificent. And John, I think, probably has the best staff in Congress. Particularly, I don't know if you've ever had a chance to meet Dr. Warren Carroll or Peter Stark. You may have seen Peter Stark if you saw the John Wayne film, No Substitute for Victory. Peter Stark was the double amputee Green Beret in there who spoke on aid and trade. Absolutely a magnificent individual. These people helped John. John, I'm absolutely convinced that within the next few years is going to be the most influential congressman in Washington. And after having said that, I give you the man who I pray to God will someday be President of the United States. I guess you better get it.
All right. Gary, you said you expected in 10 years I'd be one of the most influential men in Congress. Then you said I should be the President of the United States. If you mean that I should be President of the United States after 10 years, I've got to have an awful lot of help from you people out there because in 10 years, no, wait, I'm not saying I'm running, but I'm going to say because in 10 years, that job's going to be called Emperor and not President. So, by the way, speaking of my early years in office when they used to refer to me as the avowed member of the John Birch Society, do you know why they stopped doing that, Gary? The reason they did is because I initiated proceedings to change my last name to Bircher, so that then whenever my name was headlined in a story, when they would say Bircher does this and Bircher was that, they'd have the correct name, and it would just frustrate them. So, by the way, speaking of Orange County and Disneyland, you know, you commented on my background, formerly a Marine jet pilot and a college professor and state legislator, now congressman and all this. Those of you who have large families or any size families, those of you who have children, know that the children have there's a society of their own, and none of those past positions that I've held have impressed my youngsters, except the one you didn't mention, Gary. You didn't mention that I was a security officer at Disneyland or a policeman or a cop at Disneyland. Now, I was visited by another professor from another college of European origin. He came driving up the neighborhood. He didn't know where I lived exactly. He saw a bunch of kids playing around, and he asked in his German accent, he says, "Is Professor Schmitz around? Where does Professor Schmitz live?" And little kids looked at each other and says, "There's no Schmitz in this neighborhood except Johnny and Joey's dad, and he's a cop at Disneyland." Yeah. By the way, Johnny and Joey aren't here. They're downstairs learning judo down there. I've got the whole family up here, all 7 of them, the first 7 of my children. I like to throw those things out to strike fear and terror into the ZPG group. There's no population explosion. It's just that tax users are growing faster than taxpayers. That's the only problem. Anyway, my wife has the 5 younger children, and she's not here because she's out while we're in the area here in Boston. most of the children have never been here, and so Mary is taking them around, seeing all the sights, Lexington, Concord, Plymouth Rock, Faneuil Hall, Chappaquiddick, all the... this is not going to be a political talk, but for those of you who may wonder how, an avowed member of the John Birch Society can survive in politics, I have a ready-made campaign slogan for re-election that really brought me through when I ran for re-election to Congress. Some of you have heard it. Some of you may have even seen our bumper strip, which was, when you're out of Schmitz, you're out of gear. When I first ran for office, some people wanted me to change my name. They thought it's bad enough having a German name and a mustache with all those World War II reissue movies going on. But the mustache they thought should go, and they thought the name maybe I should change it to the English version. I told people that my name used to be Smith, the English version. But when I got married, I had to change it to the German version because as John and Mary Smith, we couldn't get a motel room anywhere. So we just... Now, as I have a serious message here, but I have to tell you a couple other things yet here, because with my large family, you can well imagine that I'm either Mormon or Catholic, and I happen to be the latter. And when I returned from Carl McIntyre's victory march a while back, this rally, by the way, has the two legislators who marched in the victory rally speaking, John Reordering tomorrow and myself today. And when I returned to Congress the day after the victory march, a couple of my Catholic colleagues came up and said, "How come you were there marching with Carl McIntyre? Aren't you a Catholic?" And I said, "Yeah, it's an interesting thing. Till I showed up, I thought the invitation was from Cardinal, not Carl McIntyre. I just... I'll tell you, if Cardinal McIntyre wouldn't be advanced in years, he'd have been there, I'm sure. But anyway, I have one other. I heard in the news yesterday that Bernadine Devlin was expecting. But she's got principles. She's not going to tell who did it. She's got... anyway, there's a story they tell about when, I don't know if it's true or not, but when Bernadine was a little girl a couple of months ago, back in... no, it was longer than that, but back when she was the age that, like other little girls, she was bouncing a ball down the streets of her town in Ireland, and she was singing a little rather inflammatory ditty. It went something like this: the Protestants own all the houses, the Protestants own all the houses, and she bounced the ball, skipping past a priest who said to her, "No, little girl." He stopped her, and he said, "No, little girl." She says, "We're trying to solve our problems here, and why do you have to sing that inflammatory little ditty?" He says, "Can't you find something that we have in common with our Protestant brethren and sing that as you bounce your ball?" So she thought a while. She thought, "Well, okay, I'll try this one." So she bounced the ball along, and she said, "Christ was born in a stable, Christ was born in a stable." And as she rounded the corner, and the priest is smiling, thinking he's solved a little problem here, he hears her singing in the distance, "Christ was born in a stable, because the Protestants own all the houses." I thought I'd filibuster a little bit to bring us on time. Now I'll have to speed up my speech so that we don't run over time here. Because I have a serious message, at least it's a semi-serious message. It's about the lib word of the year. Now, some of you may be familiar with Dr. Angst's book about how to be a liberal. And he has one chapter on the lib word of the year. And, it's been such thing as, what was last year's or the year before? They had such a word as, pardon? Poverty. Well, no, they get a little more sophisticated than poverty, such things as, when I was in college, you could pass any education exam by meeting the needs of the whole child. But the one a couple of years ago was relevant, and that's been around for quite a while, and meaningful before that. And this last year, of course, it's been reordering priorities. And so that's the topic of my speech today, is reordering priorities. And I'd like to talk about what reordering priorities really means. I've been in on the reordering priorities now for quite a while, not trying to do it, but trying to analyze just what these people are all up to. And there's one common denominator that keeps coming through, and one big lesson that keeps coming up, and that is that reordering priorities is not good for us. In fact, one might gather that it's part of the war that we are in. You know, back about 11 years ago, or 10 or 11 years ago, J. Edgar Hoover, in a speech to one of the large veterans organizations down in Miami Beach, was quoted as saying, "We're at war, and the sooner we realize it, the better off we'll be." You know, one of the cliches that doesn't make any sense at all is that it takes two to make a fight. It doesn't. If one person doesn't know he's in a fight, or wants to kid himself that he isn't in a fight, or simply doesn't want to fight, that doesn't stop the fight. It simply means that the person who won't fight gets clobbered sooner. It's as simple as that. That when you have an enemy who's sworn to your destruction, you don't have it within your own means to stop the fight. Or they talk about our nation now pulling out of the war, or they don't talk about pulling out of the war, they're saying stopping the war. We might pull out of the war, but we don't stop the war. Just as if you don't want to fight, you can stop fighting, but that doesn't mean that your enemy who is sworn to your destruction stops fighting. Well, let me just bring this into line with reordering priorities and perhaps step back a moment and put this in the proper perspective. I'm not going to get into judging people's motives at this time, but I think all of us in this room would realize that there are some politicians who are subversive, and there are some who are simply pragmatic. And sometimes they act the same. In fact, it's difficult to tell them apart, right? So I'm not going to judge the subversives as to who is subversive and who is pragmatic. I'm just going to say, here's what happens, for whatever the motives. And let's just be real idealistic here and for the time being let's say they're all pragmatic. It's not true, but let's just say that for the argument I'm going to make. One of the main problems, if not the main problem, politically with regard to the electorate and to the population in general, is that most people want to get something for nothing. It's the old coveting commandment. They covet, and they feel that stealing collectively via the ballot box is less hazardous than stealing individually. And so they vote for the man who promises something for nothing, and there are politicians who will capitalize on this weakness or seeming tendency in people, and he will ride to office promising that people can vote themselves into plenty instead of working for it. Other speakers have commented on the same point. So when a politician, and when all those politicians get into office, having gotten into office on the premise that they can give the people something for nothing, they have to produce if they want to stay in office. And those are the good politicians, aren't they? The ones that keep their word, right? They keep their word. By golly, we sent him up to get us the goodies, and he's getting us the goodies. And these are the good politicians, as opposed to the ineffective ones. That's another lib word of the year. That's applied to their opponents, you know. Someone once called me ineffective. I said, ineffective for what? For playing your ball game? I said, I'm not even on your team. I'm on the defensive team. You can't yell at me for not gaining yardage. I haven't had the ball yet. But anyway, at any rate, the effective politicians are the ones who ride to office promising that they're going to give the people something for nothing and then produce when they get there. And of course, you can't get anything for nothing. That's one of the problems with man deifying himself collectively in government. He feels that he can create things, and man doesn't. He has to operate within the natural law, within God's law, and one of the aspects of that law is that you don't get anything for nothing. And government doesn't produce a thing, it simply redistributes. And so what we have in government is an imbalance of payments, I suppose you can call it, where the governments at all levels spend more than they take in. And since they spend more than they take in, they run into problems. The first way of solving that problem is to raise taxes, and that's been going on for a long time. You all know the famous Harry Hopkins quote, we'll tax and spend and elect, and that's been going on ad nauseum as long as I've been actively participating in politics. But as all of you also know, there's a saturation point that is reached after a while in which there is a huge taxpayers' rebellion that develops, and that has developed. And there have been people at many levels of government who've been thrown out of office because they were partially and blamably, if that's a word, responsible for raising taxes. But there's another way of raising taxes and solving this imbalance of payments that is unique to the federal government, and that is the indirect taxation of inflation. And you've already heard speakers comment on that. If you haven't heard Stuart Crane, you've got to hear him. He does an excellent job of analyzing the method of spending money you don't have by creating it at the top level of government, but this is resigned for the federal government. You know, the federal government, if I might just summarize basically what happens in this indirect taxation, I'll use this analogy. If I have a gallon of water and I take a gallon of wine and pour it into the gallon of water, I can peddle that 2 gallons of liquid as wine and claim that I now have 2 gallons of wine and I've created wine out of 1 gallon of water and 1 gallon of wine. I've in effect created a gallon of wine out of nothing or nothing but water. I really haven't. But everyone that buys a glass of wine after that gets cheated, but it also means that they get half value in every glass of wine they get after that. And so when the federal government raises the debt ceiling, by the way, my party was up there when we raised it $35 billion this last year. And we did something else this last year when we raised the debt ceiling $35 billion. That was missed. Most of you missed it. You know we raised the debt ceiling $35 billion. But up until this last year, the debt was always carried in short-term loans. And this year, we decided that, we're going to always have the debt with us, so let's allow the debt to be incurred under long-term loans also, which means that we have now, you might say, solidified or institutionalized the deficit spending. Up until now, we at least kept the facade that this is temporary and therefore was in short-term loans. But we have now institutionalized the debt, which was perhaps as significant as the largest single jump of $35 billion. But when the federal government can raise the debt ceiling $35 billion by this device known as the Federal Reserve System that I won't go into at this time, that most of you are familiar with, and if not, get Gary Allen's tapes on this subject. That's the commercial. Okay. But it allows the money system to bring in $35 billion more dollars. The federal government gets to spend first. And what it means, it dilutes the value of the rest of the money already in the system, such as the water dilutes the value of the wine that you already have. And it's indirect taxation. I can steal $2 out of your pocket. If you have $2 in your pocket, I can steal one of those dollars by reaching into your pocket. But if those are the only $2 in the money system, I can steal half of your money by just creating $2 more and not touch your pocket. But it keeps the money in your pocket and dilutes the value, the spending value of your money in half without me touching you. And of course, this is the indirect tax of inflation, and this is the second method that governments have gone to by trying to keep up with their promises of getting to office by promising something for nothing. You folks can vote for a living instead of working for a living. Just vote for the right person, or the left person, as the case may be. Now, there comes a point where you face the specter of runaway inflation. And anyone who's studied runaway inflation in any other country knows that even those who like to capitalize on inflation don't like to see the chaos, or some of them don't like to see the chaos unless that's exactly what they're planning for, which is the case of some subversives. But a lot of the plain pragmatic types don't like the runaway inflation because it is uncontrollable, and the other way is a lot better. You like to keep even the controlled opposition under control. And so they go to a third device of meeting this voracious appetite of government expenditures, which comes from the need to spend more and elect and elect and elect. And this third device is you rob from Defense Peter to pay for Socialist Paul. In other words, you take the largest single expenditure of the federal government, which 10 years ago was still the major expenditure. I think most people in this room would agree that there is a legitimate function of government, and that's protecting lives and property. You'll also agree that as we've seen developments happen over the last 10 years, that as the government tries to be all things to all people, it loses its ability to do that which it ought to do, protect lives and property, both internationally and domestically. And one of the main problems in our stature on the national defense scene and your inability to walk the streets safely at night is due to the fact that the government has gotten into those things which it should not do and therefore has lost its ability to do those things which it ought to do. Now, this is called reordering our priorities. To give you an idea of what's happened, I had a little chart, but it wouldn't be able to be seen by the people in the back or even in the second row anyway, so I'll tell you what the chart was. This came out by the administration, which, by the way, brags that it's the first administration to spend more money on butter than guns. And I've gone to the administration, to the liaison with Congress over and over again, trying to tell them two things. My gun makers are painfully aware of that. They're all unemployed. And secondly, I would never want to employ them just to make guns, but we now find ourselves in a precarious situation, which I will mention, quoting from Mendel Rivers. But to graphically illustrate this, this graph came out from the administration with two charts on the same page. And on the top was reordering our priorities. And on the left-hand side was a chart which ran from about 60% with a sloping line down to about 30%. The 60% position was about 1956, and the 30% position was 1972. And that graph was percent of the budget spent on defense. You know, you keep hearing these lefties, or the professional peacemongers, who, by the way, do not want peace, but they want communist victory. They're leaders of the peace movement today. If you analyze them, they don't want peace. They want victory for the enemy, and analyze what their goals are. These people come up and they still say, we're spending much too much on defense. Now, how much do you need for defense? You need as much as it takes, right? There is no percentage. You need as much as it takes. I heard someone say that about ecology. By the way, that's going to be my next crusade. I've got them up to here. I've just got them up to here. That's not what my speech is on, but I'm, for those of you who take my newsletter, you'll see it in my newsletter. It just seems that these professional ecologists, they start out with dirty air and end up getting into bed with me and telling me how many kids I can have. And they also pick on two main enemies, don't they? Always the military and the capitalists. They're always the ecological villains, aren't they? Oh, you didn't take that picture, did you? Not like that. Oh, jeez, no. Oh, jeez. Oh. That's got me. You know, that's not as bad, you know. Gary walked in the room once when I was giving a speech, and I said, "Hi, Gary." And that one. They even painted my hair down over my forehead on that picture. Well, anyway, I was talking about the ecologists who point out that I heard one the other day saying, we've got to clean up our air and our sound and everything. And someone said, well, how much do we need? How much do we have to spend? And he said, as much as it takes. As much as it takes. That's fine. That's fine. We'll have the cleanest, purest slave country in the world. You know, as much as it takes. Now, I say the same thing about defense. How much do you have to spend? As much as it takes. Now, you can overspend. You can overspend. And you can overspend so that you debauch your currency and you go down that way. There's a balance you have to get. But the balance is not in the direction that the professional peacemongers and the ecologists are going when they say we are spending too much. That graph was an accurate graph from 60%, roughly 60% in 1956, down to about 30% projected for 1972. The other graph on the other side was that euphemism for socialism, human resources development. And that one went from about 20% in 1956 to about 40% projected for 1972. So you see, since 56, roughly, we have halved the percentage that we're spending on defense and doubled the percentage we're spending on human resources development. Now, are we spending this wisely, and what's happening? Well, let me go into this. First of all, let me talk about some of the human resources development that we're spending money on. I'm going to hit a few areas that I'm familiar with because of my committee assignments in Congress, which are the House Internal Security Committee, the old, what the lefties used to call the Un-American Activities Committee, which is one of the few that I think is not dominated by the other side. And I don't mean party-wise. You know, the next bill I'm going to talk about, I'll have to comment on the parties. The bill I wanted to talk about here, which came before my other committee, the Interstate and Foreign Commerce Committee, I'm specifically on the subcommittee on Health and Environment. Yes, that's a new name. It used to be called Health and Welfare, but environment was the lib word of next year maybe, or this year too. So let me tell you about a bill that we just passed this last week. It cost almost $3 billion, and it was called the Health Manpower Bill. Its number is H.R. 8629. Now, what that bill did, ostensibly, you may have read about it in the paper, it solved the problem of our doctor shortage. You got a doctor shortage? What's your answer? Government does it. Over and over we've heard speakers here point out, if you've been here at this whole rally, and they pointed out the fact that man is deifying himself via government. And so if you have a doctor shortage, and by the way, the facts didn't show there was, but if there was, then what you do is you set up, in this country it was a 3-year plan, not a 5-year plan. We set up a 3-year plan. A 3-year plan to solve the doctor shortage. $2.8 billion, which was aid to medical schools. It also had a type of reverse discrimination, setting up what is the first step of a quota system, which, and I have talked to members of minority groups that feel exactly the way I do, that this is just as degrading and just as discriminatory to say that you've got to go to school because you fall into a minority than to say that you can't go because you're in a minority. And at any rate, it's got that. And it's got direct aid to students and to medical schools, what they call a capitation grant, directly. It used to be, the policy used to be, that the federal government aided medical schools via research. The old saying, he who controls my purse strings controls me, is very true. And so the federal government up to now simply had a claim on the research facilities and faculties of the colleges. But now they've taken off the facade. They've taken off the facade. Right now, despite the 9th and 10th Amendments of the Constitution, the federal government is going to aid medical schools directly. This program had been put through a couple of years ago, but hadn't been funded till this year. And this year, we're going on and we're going to fund it and carry it on. So it's not exactly a new program, but it got its real shot in the arm just this last week. 3 no votes. 3 no votes. 1/3 of them are standing in front of you today, obviously. But the point is that the whole mentality is, you've got a problem, is there a doctor shortage, by the way? Oh, let me just give you some statistics for those of you doctors in the audience here. In 1963, the ratio of physicians to patients in the United States was 140 per 100,000 population. At that time, healthcare officials had as their goal the maintenance of that ratio. In 1970, the ratio had risen to 156 physicians per 100,000. By the way, physicians are growing at a rate of about 12% a year, whereas the population is growing at the rate of about 3 or 4% a year. But nevertheless, there's a doctor shortage, they say. Without the bill that we passed this week, it was estimated in testimony before our committee that by 1985, there would be 190 doctors per 100,000 population. Despite these statistics, we had to have a $3 billion program to solve the doctor shortage. You've seen that old sign, don't confuse me with the facts, my mind was made up. Every member of the subcommittee that heard that bill co-authored the bill before we even heard it. I was the only one that didn't co-author. I said, well, I kind of playing the country bumpkin, gee, I don't think I ought to co-author it because I'd like to hear what the evidence is for the need of the bill. What is this? Well, it wasn't surprising then that I was the only no vote in committee against the bill, but the evidence was there to disprove that you needed it. There may be a shortage of doctors in certain areas. The evidence wasn't that there was a shortage of doctors, except that as you move towards socialized medicine, you create a form of mass hypochondria, is that the proper term, in which you may need more doctors. And I've heard even good conservatives say, well, but with rising medical prices, if we get more doctors, you'll have a larger supply of doctors, and it'll bring prices down. Well, not so. The reason for the rising prices And I think you could prove it by a simple chart to show that to the extent that the federal government has poured money into medicine in general, to the extent that the federal government has socialized medicine, prices have gone up because of a larger availability of money to be spent on medicine. Now, that would seem to be a much more logical answer than suddenly doctors are charging more. Well, they are. Why? Because they can get more. Because there's more money available to be spent on medicine. Well, I don't want to go on a dissertation on medicine here, but I wanted to bring it out to show the type of bill that passes without much notice. Last week, did it get much notice? Almost $3 billion, just like that. $3 billion. For what? To solve a mythical doctor shortage? When Secretary Richardson of HEW appeared before the subcommittee, he was very enthusiastic, not necessarily about this specific bill, but about the program, and he later did endorse this bill. But he testified, and I said, Mr. Richardson, or Secretary Richardson, has our party, because he's a Republican too, and I was referring to his and my party, has our party become like the British Labour Party, or excuse me, the British Conservative Party? Being the so-called conservative, more conservative of the two parties, do we feel that our job is like the British Conservative Party, simply the party that runs socialism more efficiently than the other one? And Dr. Roger Eggerberg, who was sitting next to him, missed the point completely, missed my barb completely. And he said, oh, yes, that's right. Yes, we're doing a good job. Yes, sir. Or words to that effect, sentiments to that effect. Well, I could talk about other bills, but I want to get on to the military aspects here. I could talk about the water bill that we are taking up now. After we finished the health manpower bill, the chairman, after getting my opposition, he said, well, John, he said, next week we're going to take up a bill that even you can support. He said, it's a clean water bill. And I said, yes, as long as you clean out the fluorides, I'll be for it. But let me give you a preview of coming attractions on the clean water bill. Who's not in favor of clean water? It's like education. Who's not in favor of education? Well, very few people are against education, health, clean water. But when any of us are against the federal government getting into it, we then accused of being against education, clean water, and so forth. Now, it seems to me that the American people at the local level, in fact, if there's any problem that could be solved at the local level, it ought to be clean water. The American people ought to be smart enough to solve their water problems. Water is rather essential. Water is something we all want. Clean water is something we all want. But mark my words, there will be a federal clean water bill. There is already a standard set up for the federal government getting into the water business for water that travels interstate. Comes under the Interstate Commerce Clause, and at least there is a constitutional basis for that. But the new bill is going to have standards for all water, whether it goes interstate or not. Once more, the facade is dropped, just as in the research grants for medical schools, where it used to be up until this last year, it seems to me, that the federal government used to at least put on a pretense of living within the Constitution. They used to just drive through the loopholes, but it was a pretense of abiding by the Constitution. Not so anymore. The facade is being dropped. Right now, we are getting into the water business, and not just the safe water business, but the nice water business. Because there are going to be two standards, one for safety and one for aesthetics. Because the committee has taken upon itself at the federal level to decide what is nice water or aesthetic water. That you don't want unclean water, or rather smelly water, or discolored water. Now, if the people at the local level can't complain to their local water board about foul-smelling water, I hardly think the federal government is going to solve a problem like that if the people are that stupid that they can't solve that problem at the local level. But there is a great danger here. I'm not just criticizing. You see what happens. Once the federal government gets into the water business for all water, setting standards for all water, and once they decide that it's not just water safety, but water niceness, then it's only a matter of them deciding what's nice to add to it, right? And I can just see the Paul Ehrlichs and all of them going up there to Washington and to the whatever it set up a clean water commission, so going to the commission to decide what's nice water. Now, don't misquote me, because I'm not saying that this bill says you can add anything. It just cleans it up. But once the federal government gets into the business of deciding what type of water the people should drink, and once they go beyond safety, you've got problems. You see, we're in a big chess game. It's very difficult to fight in Congress or elsewhere. You've had the same problem, to fight the individual moves of the pawns and rooks. It's only when you know the master plan, the big chess game, when you can fight this. And unless you teach people the big picture and the chess game, you're going to have trouble. And this is our big trouble in Congress. People say, oh, John, you're not against clean water, are you? Are you in favor of foul-smelling water? And that question has been posed. I said, no. I am against the federal government assuming the power to decide what type of water, even going above and beyond the safety level, what type of nice water the people should have. It's a little too heady for the government, either the subversives or the pragmatists. Let's talk a little bit about revenue sharing. I was glad to see in Ed Griffin's film strip, his most recent one, about the capitalist conspiracy, that he mentioned revenue sharing. Because I'm sorry to say some of my conservative colleagues have fallen for the rhetoric of revenue sharing. And revenue sharing is not the salvation of local government. It is the coup de grace of local government. When I was in the State Senate of California, I was the chairman of the Senate Committee on Local Government. I understand the problems of local government, and the problems of what I said are just exactly what I said before. The problem of local government is the problem of government at all levels. The people in office are spending more money than they take in. That's their problem. And those of you from New York know that even Governor Rockefeller had to cut back on his expenditures because he reached the saturation point. You see, local governments have to operate, and this is as a rule, local governments, either state or local, cannot operate in a deficit. They have to operate with a balanced budget. This is really frustrating for politicians at the state and local level when they reach the saturation point. I remember reading an article in Reader's Digest last time I was aboard an airplane about revenue sharing. It must have been placed there by someone with an interest in revenue sharing because it was timed perfectly, and it told all about how bad it was in local government, why Governor Rockefeller had to cut back. And in California, we had to cut about $800 million out of a welfare program, and it was just terrible about things at the local level. What the answer was, we had to give them a source of more money. Let me very quickly tell you what revenue sharing is, exactly what it is. It's a device by which local and state constitutions and statutes can be bypassed, in spirit, if not in the law. In other words, let's take California, for example. In California, the state cannot spend any more money than it takes in. They can go out to bond issues, but they have to go to the people for a vote for that. They cannot operate on a deficit. So what does revenue sharing allow? The federal government, which has no money, which just this last year went $35 billion in a hole, will go an extra $5 billion in a hole, give part of it to the state of California so they can operate with a balanced budget. So it's really not revenue sharing at all, is it? It's deficit sharing. And it allows local and state governments to bypass their own constitutions and statutes. And that's why they all want it. It simply gives them a way out of their present predicament, which is that they have reached the saturation point. Why, in California, people are turning down local bond issues for schools. They're turning down local bond issues at the state level. The people have an identifiable need. That's one of next year's lib words, identifiable needs. And Secretary Richardson kept pointing out about the identifiable needs. I said, Mr. Richardson, my constituents have a very identifiable need, and that is no more taxes. And by the way, with all the talk about the federal government taking this money and sending it down to the local level where those people know how to spend it and they're much better, they're closer to the people, there is one option you don't get, and that is not to have the program at all. You see? The federal government is now going to take the Model Cities program, and instead of administering it from Washington, they're going to say, we're going to put it down to the local level and let you people in the local level administer the Model Cities program. They're going to take such things as urban renewal and things like that, put them down at the local level, And the rhetoric of this has caught up some conservatives in Congress. Isn't it a lot better to administer these things at the local level? But you don't make policy at the local level, you administer at the local level. They do that in the Soviet Union. The choice you don't get is whether you want the Model Cities program at all. You see, revenue sharing, it does not save local government. It saves local elected officials. It's a great thing for them, so no wonder they're all for it. It's a way out. They might get thrown out of office for not producing, for being ineffective, for not being able to live up to their promises. Revenue sharing is a very dangerous move. You may wonder, you think here, I had an interview from someone from AP just before coming in here, and after I gave him a few of my ideas that I was going to point out in this speech, and he says, "Oh, you're a Democrat, huh?" I said, "Why do you say that?" I said, "Do you say that because I am against some of the administration policies?" I might point out, by the way, that Congressional Quarterly came out with a rating on who goes along with the administration programs, and guess who was number one in opposition? Me. Geez. Number 2 was H.R. Gross of Iowa. Number 3 was John Rarick, who will be here tomorrow. Just commenting on this, just taking another little aside here. Last night I was on a radio program right down the basement here. I said he asked me to comment on the rally up here. And I said it was a rally of patriotic organizations and so forth, sort of a coalition of patriotic groups, 55 or so booths set up. And the question he asked implied that apparently we patriots are, that patriotism consists of supporting the administration. And that wasn't the exact question, but I happened to think about it as I left later. It had to do with the war in Vietnam. And I happen to think that I haven't heard a kind word for the administration since I've been here this weekend, but and I'm not going to get into politics here. And by the way, I'm not complaining. But let me get on to the other problem. As I pointed out, we're reordering our priorities. I've talked a little bit about what we're going to spend it on. Human resources development, revenue sharing, ecological contracts. I told some of my unemployed former defense engineers in my district who asked me if I could help get them ecology contracts. I said, if there are some available, you may as well have them as well as anyone else. I'm a good loser. But you better work along with me to solve the real problem. It doesn't make any difference how nice a situation your stateroom is in if the ship sinks, and it doesn't make any difference whether you've got a job within ecology contracts if in a couple of years you're getting those contracts from the Kremlin. Doesn't do much good. Well, let me just go on to this problem. Dr. McBurney last night commented on Mendel Rivers' speech in late September. I was there on the floor, along with 25 of my colleagues out of 435 listening to Mendel Rivers' speech. Dr. McBurney mentioned that the speech, or implied that the speech could have killed Mendel Rivers, and someone asked me about that after the meeting last night. And it very well could have. Mendel Rivers had been suggested to Mendel Rivers that he have open heart surgery about 6 months before he gave the speech, and he held off because he wanted to give this speech in September. Later in fall, he had the open heart surgery from which he did not recover, and putting off the operation by a few months could very well have been the deciding factor in whether he lived or died. But Mendel Rivers felt that this speech had to be given. When he started his speech with these words, and I'm quoting from the pamphlet that is available from the Armed Services Committee. It's called The Soviet Threat. He says, Mr. Speaker, never before in the 30 years of my membership in this body have I stepped into the well of this House with greater concern for the future of this nation. He then went on to document the problems of reordering priorities. He didn't put it in those terms, but of how we are not spending enough on defense, and I'm not going to reiterate what Dr. McBurney said last night because, in general, his statistics were quite accurate as much as I could tell. Mendel Rivers ended the speech with a quote from now President Richard Nixon. He wound up saying, this is Mendel Rivers speaking now, "These are the facts that confront our President, our Congress, and our defense planners. These are the facts which reflect the prophetic wisdom of an observation once made by a gentleman by the name of Mr. Richard M. Nixon when he said, 'If present trends continue, the United States, a very few years hence, will find itself clearly in second position, with the Soviet Union undisputably the greatest military power on earth.'" Mendel Rivers then wound up his speech with this one simple sentence: "I am afraid that that day has already arrived." Now, you might say, well, Richard Nixon apparently was just saying that for politics because he certainly hasn't lived up to it. And I confronted Mel Laird when he spoke to what we call the 91st Club, which are those members of Congress who came during the 91st Congress. I asked Secretary of Defense Laird about this. I said, Mendel Rivers gave a very sobering speech, which did not get much press. He maintained that we are now number 2 to the Soviet Union. I said, being number 2 to a system sworn to our destruction isn't a very comforting thought. I said, was Mendel Rivers wrong? Now, this is the Secretary of Defense. By the way, the next day, and I'm not saying I caused it, but the next day or so, he announced that he was going to retire after this year. But at the time, he gave a very, what I would consider, reading between the lines, rather weak or unenthusiastic, I think would be a better word, unenthusiastic answer. He said, yes, the Soviets are stronger than we are, but we, along with our allies, are stronger than the Soviet Union. You see? Now, I didn't intend to talk about the McNamara or Pentagon papers here. To me, when the New York Times is in a fight with the CFR-dominated administration, it's about as phony as a professional wrestling match. Therefore, I've never really gotten off much in this, but there is one result that may come from this revelation. You know, and if I were running the administration, I'd have just got the Times for receipt of stolen property and let it go at that. But one thing is for sure, what are our allies going to do now if they know that any type of an alliance they make with us is going to become public record? You know, we had a resolution the other day introduced by Congresswoman Bella Abzug. It was on the floor, quite a few co-authors, and it wanted complete revelation of all the secrets. You know, for those of us who have been after the Yalta and the Keel Hall papers for quite a while, sometimes even conservatives go for this, but what they wanted was revelation such as the military might of South Vietnam, what their capabilities are, and you know very well that as soon as, if the South Vietnamese tell us their military capabilities and we let them be known publicly, that's giving the enemy a leg up. That's why I say these professional peace advocates are for enemy victory, not for peace. This is the tenor of their movement constantly. So we have this situation where our allies will not want to form an alliance, and how trustworthy are they anyway? So here we are now, second to the Soviet Union. Now, some people take the attitude that this is being overplayed to get us to surrender, like a poker game, to get us to throw our cards in, and the subversives here are undoubtedly trying to pull that. I mean, I'm not going to play down the fact that, as in Ed Griffin's new film strip, that the same group might be running both the communist and the capitalist conspiracy. I'm not going to play down that at all. Nevertheless, I'm not going to take a chance. I'd just as soon have my defenses up internationally and take care of the subversives internally. Let's get them both. Now let's talk a little bit, wind it up with the subversives internally. You know, I use the analogy of a sour grapes attitude. You know, as we reorder our priorities and steal from Defense Peter to pay Socialist Paul, we engage in this mirrors game of convincing ourselves we didn't need all those guns anyway. The enemy is really not so bad. Look, the Chinese ping pong team, a red Chinese ping pong team, didn't beat us bad. They were nice guys. They held the score down. And by the way, I on the floor of Congress publicly invited the Rhodesian ping pong team over here. I thought I haven't had any reaction from the State Department or the White House, but who knows? It might establish a whole new era of friendship and trade. Okay. But at any rate, we kid ourselves with this idea that we don't have an internal or external enemy at all. I've used another analogy. Many of you who've heard me speak before have used it. I especially like this in describing the John Birch Society. If there's a murderer, thief, rapist, overall bad guy, crawling into your window while you're dead asleep at night, and you've got a dog out in your yard barking at the intruder, and you're awakened by the barking of that dog, you've got a couple of problems. Your immediate problem is discomfort at being awakened. You can convince yourself, you can take care of that problem by convincing yourself that your dog has an incurable case of acid indigestion that must be taken care of immediately. You can grab your shotgun, go out and shoot the dog, and go back to sleep, and you've solved your immediate problem. That's a lot easier, isn't it? You can kid yourself. So, it's a little touch of mental illness there for doing it. You can kid yourself, though, but that's not going to solve your ultimate problem. And today, I don't mean we here in this room, but this nation is engaging in just that type of activity. You remember the couplet that gave title to John Stormer's book? Treason doth never prosper, what's the reason? For when it doth prosper, none dare call it treason. You could draw another chart here, and to the extent that internal subversion gets worse and the external threat of enemies from without gets greater, to that extent, these issues are no longer issues. Do you remember when the missile gap was still a presidential issue? Do you remember when internal subversion was still an issue? Why, it got Dwight Eisenhower into office, if you remember the so-called McCarthy era. We have a new McCarthy era. It's the Charlie McCarthy era. It's what I call our youth movement today. Don't trust anyone over 30 except the guy pulling the string. I got a poll from a San Francisco newspaper the other day. It said, which of the following issues, and it had about 15 issues, do you consider most important for the coming year? The fact, as Mendel Rivers said, that according to Mendel Rivers, we are number 2 militarily now, that was not an issue. Neither was it an issue that we have subversion in this country. One of the biggest news items of the year was the April-May offensive in Washington, wasn't it? And I suppose you people here are in a very unique crowd. Many of you, according to the applause when Gary mentioned my newsletter, are aware of the fact that I did put 45 pages, along with 2 other congressmen, Fletcher Thompson of Georgia and Roger Zion of Indiana, put 45 pages into the congressional record the Wednesday before those demonstrations started, documenting the fact that the 2 groups running the April-May offensive were dominated by the Communist Party USA, led and dominated by the Communist Party USA and the Socialist Workers' Party. Dominated is a difficult word. To be more accurate, I'll quote from the Democrat chairman of our Internal Security Committee. Under the substantial leadership of the Communist Party USA, and there was no doubt that the other group was under real domination by the Socialist Workers' Party. Now, the Socialist Workers' Party is not, even the Norman Thomas version of socialism. They are the Trotskyites. They are growing faster than the Communist Party USA. They are just as dedicated to overthrowing the government, just as pushy about using violent or illegal or unconstitutional means. The Socialist Workers' Party has not gotten the publicity it ought to get. It is a communist movement also. To say that the Communist Party USA is the only group of communists in the country is to say that the Christian church that calls itself that name are the only people who you can call Christians. In other words, there is a Protestant denomination known as the Christian Church. And to say that they are the ones who should be called Christians and no one else is similar to saying that the Communist Party USA are the only people you can call communists. I think this should have been pointed out when we Birch members keep talking about other members of the communist conspiracy, and then say, prove it, is he a card-carrying member? The Socialist Worker Party members are not only Marxists, they are also Leninists, but they are Trotskyites. Trotsky differed from Stalin not on where they're going, what they're doing, or even methods, but simply, I shouldn't say simply, but primarily on the fact that a dictatorship can't have two leaders. It's as simple as that. And in this movement now, in the April and May offensive in Washington, the Trotskyites were running the National Peace Action Coalition, and the Communist Party USA was leading the People's Coalition for Peace and Justice. Now, these groups came out of the new MOB, which had been designated by the Senate Internal Security Committee back in 1970 under communist, well, I'll use the exact quote here. Have to be careful on these quotations. Under communist domination, to quote from the Internal Security Committee in 1970, the new MOB was under communist domination. The 45 pages that we put in the congressional record were documenting the movement of the leaders from New MOB to various other organizations until they ended up in the two groups that put on the April-May offensive in Washington. But just as in a lot of conservative organizations and patriotic organizations, there are fights and there's bickering among leadership. There was bickering between NPAC, National Peace Action Coalition, and People's Coalition for Peace and Justice as to when they should run this rally. And you know what solved the problem of getting these two groups together? Let me quote from Nguyen Thuy, the North Vietnamese ambassador to the Paris peace talks, who sent a telegram. It may not have been a telegram, a message. And I'll read the message. This is on February 27th, 1970, from the ambassador to the Paris peace talks from North Vietnam. Facing the serious situation now presented, I call upon the progressive American people and all anti-war organizations in the United States to unite closely to associate all forces and strata of the population, irrespective of their skin color, religion, and political trend, thus making a wide and strong movement so as to curb in time new military adventures by the U.S. administration, to demand an end to their war of aggression in South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, to demand the withdrawal of all American troops from Indochina and let the Indo-Chinese people settle their own internal affairs, such as the way beneficial to the peoples of Vietnam and Indochina, beneficial to the American people, beneficial to the people in the world. Finally, then on March 2nd, just within days after this message was sent, at a press conference in the Rayburn building, and I'm looking into that. I'm having my staff check into that. The Rayburn building is the new House office building in Washington. At a press conference in the Rayburn building, these two groups, the one led by the Communist Party USA, the one led and dominated by the Socialist Workers Party, had a joint press conference in which they said that they are going to co-sponsor one major anti-war demonstration on April 24th in Washington and San Francisco. Now, some other little known facts about that demonstration on the 24th. It was a quiet little affair, wasn't it? The papers said how peaceful it was. What the papers didn't say that the afternoon and evening, late afternoon, early evening, and later on in the evening of the 24th, 30-some park policemen had to flee into the Washington Monument, while the Washington Monument grounds became, and this term was used in the hearings, a virtual no man's land with the Washington police surrounding the park grounds, and the park police inside the monument, the grounds being occupied by an uncontrollable mob. It was enemy no man's land. That was the evening of the 24th. In fact, there was substantial damage to the Washington Monument, running close to $250,000 damage to the Washington Monument. If you were around there recently, the wooden slats on all the benches that circle the Washington Monument were all ripped out to be used for firewood, I suppose. About 8 of the flags that ring the Washington Monument were torn down. The Viet Cong flag was put up. And damage was done to some of the inside controls until the park police went in to protect the inside of the monument. And obscenities were scribbled as high as a person could reach on the outside, which had to be sandblasted off after the peaceful day of demonstrations on the 24th. This was a little bit of information that didn't get into most newspapers. In fact, outside of my newsletter, there wasn't much publicity on that at all. Yet it was not denied during hearings before the the House Internal Security Committee. You know, just to get back to this Socialist Workers' Party, it is the Trotskyite Party of the United States, and it is dominated, it is wholly and entirely run by them. They did run the National Peace Action Coalition. In fact, during hearings, which did not get much publicity, during hearings before the Internal Security Committee, we subpoenaed, it's one of the two lawsuits I have, we subpoenaed the bank records for the National Peace Action Coalition. And now we're fighting this out in court because we'd like to find out where the money was coming from. They spent, trying to recall, it was a good sum of money, running in the neighborhood of $100,000, the demonstrators. This was just one of the two groups. I don't recall the exact sum. We got the bank records and found that the only two people that could sign checks for the National Peace Action Coalition were members of the Socialist Workers' Party. Now remember that party. That's faster growing than the Communist Party. It's the Trotskyite Party. The person in charge of the National Peace Action headquarters that ran the demonstration was, by testimony, I'll tell you the interesting testimony, was Fred Halstead, who had been the Socialist Worker Party candidate for president back in '68. Now, we had proof that Fred Halstead was running the office. We had one witness who said, yes, everyone recognized him as the person running the office of the National Peace Action Coalition. And we had another bit of testimony that said that he had the key to the Coke machine in the National Peace Action Coalition headquarters. Throw a little levity out there, but actually anyone who's ever worked in an office knows that that is pretty good proof as to who's running the office. It wasn't the only proof we had. It was that he had the office that was recognized as the office. I wasn't making fun of the testimony. That was just some supporting evidence. If there are any newspaper men here, that's something they'd really like to make fun of. Yeah, they said the Socialist Workers' Party candidate for president was running the march because he had the Coke machine key. Actually, any of you who were there who may have witnessed the parade would have seen, as one of our witnesses saw and testified, that the parade, the whole length of the parade route was made up of Socialist Workers' Party banners. The only other banners that came close were Viet Cong flags or North Vietnamese flags, but the Socialist Workers' Party banners were dominated. And Fred Halstead himself, whom I mentioned, was also the head of the parade marshals. They were in charge of keeping the parade orderly. And by the way, for tactics, it was also testified for tactics that they are now in a peaceful stage. They did not want violence. The violence that happened at the Washington Monument was not part of the parade. It was an aftermath after they started a rock concert there in the afternoon and evening. They are disciplined enough. They are disciplined enough to have peace when they want peace, but they never disdain violence when they want violence, and they have never turned from that. Neither the Communist Party USA nor the Socialist Workers' Party, nor any of their other allies. By the way, one of the saddest things in the testimony about the April-May offensive in Washington, one of the saddest things was the appearance of a lower middle-aged grocery store operator, a woman from the Chicago suburbs, who came down there and thought she was in a movement to stop the war and have peace in Vietnam, which she wanted. It wasn't until she showed up at a meeting, a dinner for the leaders, and there were all the leaders that she had recognized that had been telling her where to go and what to do, when they had a speech by, once more, Fred Halstead, telling about how they were going to overthrow the government, with pictures of the communist leaders such as Lenin and Marx and so forth hanging up in the headquarters of the banquet hall. It's really sad when a woman leaves a Chicago suburb to come down and participate in what she thinks is a movement for peace. And she comes there and has to find out that bluntly. She left the meeting then and never went back and wrote to our committee chairman, chastising him for not warning the American people, now, don't laugh at her because this is not her fault. She didn't know. Our committee chairman, about 3 weeks before these demonstrations, had made a speech, a synopsized version of the 45 pages we put in the Congressional Record. That speech and the press release fell stillborn from the presses. Not a bit of news. Our chairman, who is a Democrat, as I said, was a little miffed at this. He then allowed the minority leader, Congressman Ashbrook, to give a similar speech. No publicity. Then 3 of us put in 45 pages just the week before the demonstration. No publicity. And so this poor middle-aged woman, thinking she's for peace, has to find out the hard way when she ends up at a speech calling for the overthrow of the government, a speech by one of the obvious leaders of the movement, a speech at a banquet of all the leaders of the movement, and she had to find out the hard way, and then wrote to our chairman saying, "Why didn't you warn us? We have an internal security committee. Isn't that your job, to warn the American people when there are such subversives or such types doing this?" Well, we can't break the paper curtain. We can't break the paper curtain, and perhaps that's a good point to make in winding up, because you're wondering, what is it? What is it? What can we do? What can we do? What can we do about this? You know, one of my favorite quotes is from Sun Tzu Wu, the ancient writer on Chinese warfare, wrote about 2,000 years ago. And one of the quotes I like to repeat is a quote that Mao Zedong likes to repeat too. Both sides of a fight can use this one. It's this, that supreme excellence in warfare is not in winning all your battles. Supreme excellence in warfare is in having the enemy surrender before going to battle. Now, the enemy's trying to get us to do this, and too often we succeed. In fact, some of the type of speeches, and I hesitate to sometimes put out the information on, for example, the threat of the enemy. And I think some of you have had the problem of putting out too much, too soon, about internal subversion, because people throw up their hands and they light their vigil lamp in their window and they pray for the end. They don't do anything about it. They say, oh, all is lost. All isn't lost. All isn't lost. The American people still do not want to lose either externally or internally. That little woman from a suburb of Chicago was on our side. After all, how many of us do like that war over there? How many of us wouldn't like it stopped? She was really on our side, and yet she was one of those marching that you saw. That huge crowd. How many of those were there? We've got to get across to those people. She's mad. That woman's mad. She's going to be on our side solidly from now on. But she found out the hard way. There's a lot of people who will listen if we can get out to them. You know, I'm a Marine Corps lieutenant colonel in the reserves. The Marine Corps has a new recruiting program, and you'll see it hitting the streets pretty soon. It's the same idea, but it's the Marine Corps wants or needs a few good men. It's the opposite of the one I mentioned, that Dr. Jones mentioned just previously, about the Army wants to join you. In fact, the Marine Corps had a poster, but they thought so they don't rekindle inter-service rivalry, they wouldn't put up that poster, which supposedly was to have said, the Marine Corps doesn't want to join you, the Marine Corps wants a few good men. The reason I bring this up is because the secret, or the way to victory, is right before us. And Stuart Crane, Dr. Crane, hit it yesterday morning. He said, for example, as a Birch member, and I'll say that as a Birch member too, and some of you are Birch members and some are not, and I'll say this, although I'm not trying to poo-poo the recruiting program, we need more, but if 10% of those who were Birch members became real Birchers, Dr. Crane said we could win. And I believe that. I believe that. I believe that if those of us who have been fighting battle fatigue for a long time, and we have, haven't we? We've been fighting battle fatigue for a long time. If we just realized, look, our back's to the wall, but it's not hopeless. Because there's a lot of people that we can still wake up. Let's wake up those little grocery operators. Let's wake up these people. We can do it. I was very encouraged that at the young people at this meeting here, at this rally. A lot of them, they can do it. They've got the old vigor. The young vigor, I should say. We can do it, and this whole movement, whether it's the external threat or the internal threat, both operate on misinformation, or shall we say, both operate in darkness. We still have a whole generation growing up feeling that we're spending much too much on defense, don't we? The young people today, we've got to stop spending so much on defense. And we've still got people who don't realize that we have an internal threat. We still have newspapers that put out a poll to a congressman listing 15 problems, never mentioning the internal or external threat. We still have people who are shocked when they hear any of the speeches that you've heard here today. And it turns them back. They say, it can't be, it can't be. They peek under the tent and they say, the tent's not there. It can't be. They're psychologically unable to take it. And there are many of you people who have been at this meeting this weekend, perhaps have had that attitude. All we need are 10% of the people who are already in patriotic organizations, such as the John Birch Society. 10% of them to come out with renewed vigor. It doesn't make any difference how many, it's who. Lenin said it himself. Lenin said that. You know, when the John Birch Society, when Robert Welch talks about using communist methods, he doesn't talk about using immoral methods. He talks about using that one. Dedication. We got into this mess because of the dedication of a few people who knew what they were doing and were disciplined enough to do it. And we're going to get out of it by getting a disciplined minority who are going to be well educated and know and not be kidded and not be stampeded and not be bedazzled and bulldozed and just stick to it and know how to do it. Now, there are enough people here. You wonder how I got elected? I'm not giving a political speech, but I didn't get elected by having massive rallies and waves of people. The dedication of a few. See, the battle going on today is not between 50% and 50%. It's between 2.5% and 2.5%, and they're fighting over to see which way they push the 95%. The battle's between the sheepdogs, not the sheep. So all we've got to do is turn some tough sheep into tough sheepdogs. You might say, what's the alternative? That would have been a good spot to end, because I only had one more sentence to go. Just keep one thing in mind. We're in a fight, and it doesn't take two to make a fight. Get this across to your friends. If you're in a fight with someone sworn to your destruction, whether he's operating internally or he's coming at you externally, if he's out to get you, you are not going to stop the fight by stopping your participation in the fight. You're just going to get clobbered sooner. So let's get out and fight. Thank you.
John assures me that he's willing to stay in there and help lead the fight. So that will end our program for the afternoon. This evening we will be here again at 7 o'clock, and I hope some of you will come a little bit earlier because we will start the music at 10 minutes to 7 tonight and hope to be underway very promptly after that. And we'll see you then.